In the late autumn of 1945, in a sprawling British-run internment camp nestled in the damp highlands of Malaya, a convoy of trucks delivered its latest cargo of surrendered Japanese personnel. The air, thin and cool, carried the scent of wet earth and distant wood smoke, a stark departure from the humid coastal plains where their war had ended in bewildering silence. These were not soldiers in the strictest sense, but women, nurses, clerks, and administrative aides who had formed the auxiliary spine of the Imperial Army's occupation. They were now prisoners, a designation their training had never prepared them for, and they sat on the hard benches of the transport trucks under the impassive gaze of British guards, their faces set in masks of rigid composure. The journey up the winding mountain roads had been long and silent, each jolt of the vehicle a punctuation mark in a terrifying new chapter they had only ever heard described in the most brutal terms. Propaganda had been their only primer for this moment, painting vivid pictures of enemy depravity, of vengeful conquerors who would inflict upon them the same horrors their own armies were said to have committed. They expected the worst, and in the shared, unspoken terror of the truck beds, that expectation was a cold, solid thing. The trucks finally ground to a halt inside a vast enclosure fenced with taut lines of barbed wire. Watchtowers stood like skeletal sentinels at each corner, their silhouettes stark against the bruised purple of the twilight sky. A British officer with a clipboard and a weary expression directed the disembarkation with clipped, economical phrases that the women did not understand but whose intent was clear. They were herded out, stumbling on stiff legs, their movements clumsy with exhaustion and dread. They formed ragged lines on the damp, packed earth, their eyes downcast, avoiding the faces of their captors. Among them stood Chie, a woman in her late 30s who had been a senior administrator. Her face was a study in impassive control, but her hands, hidden in the folds of her worn tunic, were clenched into tight fists. Beside her, much younger, was Akiko, whose fierce loyalty to the emperor still burned in her dark eyes, a small, defiant flame in the gathering gloom. She stared directly at the British soldiers, her chin held high, as if daring them to begin the torments she was certain were coming. And a few places down the line stood Haney, a quiet girl who had worked as a typist. She observed everything with a wide, unnervating stillness, her gaze taking in the texture of the mud, the condensation blooming on the metal of a guard's rifle, the way the clouds snagged on the surrounding jungle-clad peaks. She registered details without interpretation, a human camera shutter clicking in the silence. The guards did not shout. They did not push or shove. Their movements were methodical, almost bored, as they counted the prisoners and marshaled them toward a long wooden barrack. The absence of overt cruelty was itself a source of confusion, a strange and unsettling prelude that only deepened their fear of what was to come. They were led not to an interrogation chamber or a punishment cell, but to a plain administrative building where a sergeant with a thick mustache and tired eyes sat at a wooden desk, a large ledger open before him. One by one, through a terrified translator, they gave their names and former occupations. The sergeant wrote each name down in neat, flowing script, his pen scratching rhythmically in the quiet room. It was an act of bureaucracy, not of conquest. They were being processed, catalogued, reduced to entries on a page. For Chie, the administrator, the familiarity of the procedure was the most disorienting thing of all. This was the language of order, of systems, an experience so contrary to the expected chaos of captivity that it felt like a deliberate psychological trap. Akiko gave her name with a sharp, clipped sound, her voice full of contempt. Haney whispered hers, her eyes fixed on the man's ink-stained fingers. They were numbers now, filed away in a foreign ledger under a gray sky, waiting for the true nature of their defeat to be revealed. The air grew colder as night fell, and the women were finally marched toward another building, the dread coiling tighter in their stomachs with every step. The building they were led to was made of concrete blocks, its windows high and frosted. From within came a low, steady hiss, and when the heavy wooden door was opened, a cloud of warm, damp air rolled out to meet them, carrying the clean, astringent smell of carbolic soap. It was a bathhouse. A stout British woman in a military uniform, a matron with a stern but not unkind face, stood waiting for them. She spoke no Japanese and they no English, but her gestures were unambiguous. They were to undress and leave their clothes in designated bins. The order sent a fresh wave of panic through the group. This was it, the moment of ultimate humiliation, the stripping away of their final layer of dignity before the real brutalities began. Akiko's defiance hardened. She stood rigid, refusing to move, her eyes flashing. Chie, ever pragmatic, understood the futility of resistance. Slowly, deliberately, she began to unbutton her tunic, her movements stiff but resolute. Her action broke the spell of terrified paralysis, and one by one, the other women began to follow her lead, their movements furtive and ashamed. Haney kept her eyes fixed on a crack in the concrete floor, her body trembling slightly as she shed the familiar, grimy layers of her clothing. But there were no leering male guards, no mocking laughter. Only the matron and two other uniformed British women, their expressions businesslike, their manner efficient. They were directed toward a delousing station, a place of chemical smells and fine powder, and then into the shower room itself. The walls were tiled, the floor sloped toward a central drain, and from a dozen metal heads protruding from the ceiling, hot water streamed down. The hiss grew louder, filling the chamber with a dense, cleansing steam that fogged the air and softened the hard edges of their fear. The shock of the hot water was profound. It was not a violent, cold spray meant to punish, but a steady, enveloping warmth that seemed to seep into their very bones, washing away not just the grime of the journey but weeks of accumulated filth and terror from the final days of the war. They were given small, rough bars of soap, and the simple act of lathering, of scrubbing their own skin, felt like a reclamation of self. They had expected to be violated, but instead, they were being cleaned. The steam swirled around them, obscuring faces, granting a small measure of anonymity in their shared vulnerability. Haney let the water run over her head, closing her eyes and feeling the tension in her neck and shoulders begin to dissolve. Akiko scrubbed at her skin with a fierce, angry energy, as if trying to scour away the shame of this unexpected clemency. When they were done, they were handed clean, rough towels. The linen was coarse but absorbent, and the act of drying themselves, of wrapping the fabric around their bodies, was another small, restorative ritual. They were then led to an adjoining room where piles of folded clothes awaited them. Simple, dark-colored cotton shifts and trousers, coarse but clean. The clothes were impersonal, erasing their former identities, yet they were also a provision, a basic necessity met. Dressed in this new, uniform drabness, they were led one by one into a small, brightly lit office for a medical examination. A British nurse with pale, reddish hair and calm, gray eyes waited for them. Her name, they would later learn, was Eleanor. She worked with a quiet professionalism, checking for sores, signs of malnutrition, and tropical diseases. Her touch was firm and clinical, her instruments sterile. When it was Haney's turn, the nurse gently probed a healing wound on her arm, cleaning it with antiseptic and applying a fresh bandage. Haney watched the nurse's hands, the precise, economical movements as she opened a sterile packet and snipped a length of gauze. There was no judgment in her touch, only a detached, medical concern. This systematic restoration of their bodies, cleansed, clothed, and tended to, was a profound and unsettling experience. It was an act of institutional power, certainly, but its purpose appeared to be preservation, not destruction. It dismantled their expectations piece by piece, leaving them in a state of deep and fearful confusion. What kind of enemy was this, that began its conquest not with a blow, but with a bar of soap and a clean bandage? Their first meal in the camp was served in a long, cavernous hall filled with rows of bare wooden trestle tables and benches. The air was thick with the savory smell of cooked meat and vegetables, a scent so rich and unfamiliar it made their stomachs ache with a hunger they had long suppressed. They filed in silently, taking their places on the hard benches, their eyes scanning the room with a mixture of apprehension and disbelief. They expected thin, watery gruel, the barest sustenance to keep them alive for whatever labors or punishments awaited. Propaganda had assured them that the enemy hoarded its riches while feeding its prisoners garbage, a reflection of their moral corruption. But as they shuffled forward in a line, Each woman was handed a metal tray, a spoon, and a tin mug. A British private, a young man with a face full of adolescent acne, stood behind a massive steaming cauldron, ladling out a thick, hearty stew. Chunks of potato, carrots, and unidentifiable meat swam in a rich gravy. Next to him, another soldier placed 2 thick slices of dark, heavy bread on each tray. The same meal, they noticed with a jolt, that the British guards were eating at their own separate tables at the far end of the hall. There was no distinction. The captors and the captives were being fed from the same pot. This simple, logistical fact was more powerful than any speech. It was an unspoken declaration of a principle they could not yet name, a form of equality so foreign to their hierarchical, wartime mindset that it felt like a deliberate provocation. Chia accepted her tray with a slight, almost imperceptible bow of her head, a gesture of ingrained habit rather than gratitude. She carried it carefully to her seat, her expression unreadable. Akiko took hers with a stiff, angry jerk, her face flushed with resentment. To her, this was not an act of decency but a tactic, a way to soften them, to make them dependent and weak. It was an insult to the spirit of sacrifice, an obscene parody of generosity from the nation that had defeated hers. She sat down and stared at the food, her spoon held tightly in her hand, as if it were a weapon. Haney, however, was mesmerized by the steam rising from her bowl. She watched the small, swirling eddies of vapor carry the scent of the stew upwards, a warm, living presence in the cold, cavernous room. She picked up a slice of the bread. It was still warm from the ovens, the crust firm, the inside soft and dense. She broke off a small piece and put it in her mouth, chewing slowly, letting the simple, wholesome flavor fill her senses. It was the taste of sustenance, of life, something she had not truly experienced in months. Around her, the other women began to eat, their movements hesitant at first, then with a growing, desperate urgency. The only sounds in the hall were the clinking of spoons against metal trays and the soft, rhythmic chewing of hundreds of mouths. They ate in a heavy, watchful silence, acutely aware of the British guards at the other end of the room. The guards themselves paid them little mind. They talked quietly among themselves, laughed at a shared joke, and ate with the casual familiarity of men who had shared countless meals together. They were not monsters. They were just men, tired and hungry, eating their dinner. The sight was both mundane and profoundly shocking. Haney watched a young guard use his bread to mop up the last of the gravy from his tray, a gesture so ordinary, so universally human, that it momentarily bridged the vast chasm of language, culture, and war that separated them. When the meal was over, they were required to scrape their trays and wash them in tubs of hot, soapy water at the back of the hall. The procedure was orderly, efficient. They formed a line, completed the task, and were marched back to their new barracks under the darkening sky. The food sat warm and heavy in their stomachs, a strange and contradictory comfort. It was a simple biological fact. They had been fed and fed well, but it had unsettled them more deeply than any act of cruelty could have. They had been prepared for a fight for survival against a brutal enemy. They were not prepared for an enemy who provided for them, who treated their basic needs as a matter of routine. It was a form of power they did not understand, one that disarmed their hatred and left them adrift in a sea of uncertainty. The days that followed fell into a rigid and unvarying rhythm, a structure as solid and predictable as the wooden walls of their barracks. The chaos and terror of the war's final, desperate weeks were replaced by the stark, clean lines of a timetable. A bell clanged before dawn, rousing them from their thin mattresses. They folded their blankets into neat, identical squares, a small, precise act of discipline to begin the day. Then came roll call in the misty yard, where they stood in silent rows as their names were read from a list by a British corporal. His voice was a flat, monotonous drone, the foreign sounds of their names mangled by his accent, but the ritual was absolute. It was a daily accounting, a reminder of their status as prisoners, yet also a confirmation that they existed, that they were counted. After a breakfast of thick, unsweetened porridge and a mug of a bitter, coffee-like substitute, the work details were assigned. There was no forced, punitive labor, No digging of ditches under a guard's lash. Instead, the work was functional, designed to maintain the camp itself. It was the labor of a self-contained, isolated community. Some women were sent to the laundry, a steamy, soap-scented building where they scrubbed clothes against washboards in vast concrete sinks. Others were assigned to the kitchens, where they spent hours peeling potatoes and carrots, their hands moving in a hypnotic, repetitive motion. A group was tasked with mending uniforms and linens, their needles flashing in the dim light of the sewing room. Akiko, with her fierce, contained energy, was put to work in the laundry. She attacked the soiled fabrics with a relentless fury, her knuckles white on the washboard, channeling her anger and frustration into the physical act of scrubbing. For her, the work was a continuation of the war by other means, a battle against the enemy's dirt. Chia, whose pre-war experience as an administrator was noted in the ledger, was given a different task. She was assigned to a supply depot, a large, musty-smelling hut filled with crates and boxes. Under the watchful but unobtrusive eye of a quiet, older corporal, her job was to help maintain the inventory. She counted blankets, tallied tins of food, and recorded the numbers on a clipboard. The familiar act of creating order from chaos, of imposing logic onto a collection of objects, was a strange comfort. She worked with a cool efficiency, her mind focused on the numbers, the neat columns, the tangible reality of the supplies. It was a language she understood, a world of pure logistics that existed outside of ideology or emotion. The corporal rarely spoke, but he observed her competence with a flicker of acknowledgement. Haney was sent to the camp's vegetable garden. It was a large, well-tended plot of land where neat rows of cabbages, leeks, and hardy greens grew in the dark, rich soil. Her job was to weed and water, to tend to the slow, quiet life of the plants. The work was peaceful, grounding. She liked the feel of the cool earth under her fingers, the sight of water droplets clinging to the waxy leaves of a cabbage. The rhythm of the work was dictated by the needs of the plants, not the commands of a guard. She could feel the damp chill of the highland air on her cheeks and watch the clouds drift over the mountains. In the garden, she felt a sense of purpose that was simple and undeniable. She was helping to grow the food that would feed them all, prisoners and guards alike. Overseeing the daily work details was Sergeant Davies, a man who seemed to be the very embodiment of the camp's ethos. He was not cruel, but he was utterly devoid of sentiment. He moved with a brisk, purposeful stride, his eyes missing nothing. He issued his orders in a clear, impersonal tone, and he expected them to be followed without question. He was a figure of pure procedure, a human cog in the machine of the camp. His authority was absolute, but it was the authority of the system, not of personal whim. He demanded order, efficiency, and cleanliness. A poorly folded blanket, a dirty floor, a sloppy workstation. These were the things that drew his sharp, corrective attention. The moral order of the camp was expressed through this relentless discipline. It was a world where a job done properly was the highest virtue. This structured existence, so devoid of the passionate, nationalist fervor that had driven their lives for years, began to have a subtle, transformative effect. It replaced the grand, abstract ideals of empire and honor with the small, concrete realities of a well-scrubbed floor, a neatly mended shirt, and a weed-free row of vegetables. It was a different kind of morality, one based not on sacrifice for a cause, but on the simple, daily responsibility of maintaining one's environment. Slowly, imperceptibly, the prisoners were being inducted into a new way of seeing the world. One evening, after the week's work was done, the routine was broken by an unusual announcement. The prisoners were to assemble in the mess hall after dinner. There was no explanation. A current of apprehension ran through the barracks as the women speculated in hushed whispers. Was it a new punishment? A political lecture? A display of force? They filed into the hall and took their usual places, the air thick with a nervous tension. The British guards stood along the walls, their expressions as impassive as ever. At the far end of the hall, a white sheet had been stretched taut against the wall. In the center of the room stood a strange metal contraption on a tripod, a film projector. The camp commandant, a tall, thin officer with a reserved demeanor, stood before them and spoke a few words in English, which were then relayed by the translator. They were being shown a film, he explained, for their recreation. The announcement was met with a stunned, uncomprehending silence. Recreation. The word itself was alien in their current context. They braced themselves for a barrage of propaganda, a film designed to showcase the might of the British Empire and the foolishness of their own defeated nation. The lights in the hall were extinguished, plunging the room into darkness. A thick beam of light shot out from the projector, illuminating a swirling galaxy of dust motes as it traveled across the room to the screen. The projector began to whir and click, a mechanical heartbeat in the silent hall. Flickering images appeared on the screen, grainy and black and white. It was not a war film. It was not propaganda. It was a simple British comedy, a story about a bumbling postman in a small English village. There were no soldiers, no flags, no speeches, just ordinary people in a strange, distant land, living their lives. The dialogue was incomprehensible, a stream of foreign sounds. The customs were bizarre, the humor baffling. For the first 10 minutes, the women watched in stiff, stony silence, their faces betraying nothing. Akiko stared at the screen with open contempt, seeing the film as a display of Western decadence and frivolity, a culture that had no understanding of honor or sacrifice. Chia watched with a detached, analytical curiosity, trying to parse the cultural cues, to understand the logic of this strange offering. Then, a scene of pure slapstick unfolded on the screen. The postman, distracted by a pretty girl, rode his bicycle directly into a pond. The splash was enormous, and he emerged sputtering, covered in mud and weeds, his hat askew. From the back of the hall, a single sharp bark of laughter erupted. It was one of the younger British guards, who quickly stifled the sound, his face flushing with embarrassment in the reflected light from the screen. But the spell of silence had been broken. A few of the younger Japanese women, caught off guard, let out small, suppressed giggles. A ripple of amusement, hesitant and fragile, spread through the room. Haney found herself smiling, a genuine, unforced smile that felt strange on her face. The image of the foolish man in the pond was universally funny, a piece of physical comedy that transcended the barriers of language and enmity. For a few moments, they were not prisoners and guards, not Japanese and British, but simply a roomful of people watching a film, sharing in a small, ridiculous moment of human fallibility. The projector continued to hum, its steady sound a neutral backdrop to the flickering images. The beam of light was a bridge, a temporary connection forged through the darkness, linking their world to another. They watched scenes of life in a place they could barely imagine. Tidy cottages with smoking chimneys, green fields dotted with sheep, a bustling village pub. It was a world that seemed entirely untouched by the war that had consumed their own. The film ended, the light on the screen vanished, and the hall was plunged back into darkness before the main lights came on, harsh and revealing. The shared moment was over. The silence returned, and they were once again prisoners, herded back to their barracks. But something had shifted. The cultural encounter had not taught them about their enemy's strength or virtue, but about their enemy's mundanity. They had been shown a glimpse of a world where ordinary life, with its small comedies and simple pleasures, still existed. It was a world they had been taught to despise, but which now, in the quiet of the barracks, felt achingly, impossibly distant. The experience had not fostered friendship, but it had planted a seed of profound and unsettling complexity in their understanding of the people who held them captive. The cumulative effect of these experiences, the clean clothes, the shared meals, the structured work, the unexpected film, began to ferment within the confines of the barracks. In the quiet hours after the lights were turned out, whispered conversations would ripple through the darkness. The camp's humane procedures, so contrary to their indoctrination, had created a deep fissure in their collective certainty. It was a space where doubt, once unthinkable, could begin to grow. Akiko became the fiercest guardian of their old beliefs. She saw the camp's order and fairness not as decency, but as a more insidious form of psychological warfare. Do not be fooled, She would hiss to the women on the bunks nearest to her, her voice a low, intense whisper. "This is not kindness. It is a trick. They are trying to make us weak, to make us forget who we are. They feed us and clothe us to fatten our bodies while they starve our spirits. Every piece of bread they give us is a poison meant to erode our loyalty. To accept it is to betray the emperor. It is to betray those who died." Her words found purchase in the hearts of some, especially the younger women who had known nothing but the fervent, all-consuming nationalism of wartime Japan. They clung to her interpretation because it was familiar. It allowed them to maintain their hatred, which had become a core part of their identity. Cruelty would have been easier to understand, to resist. This calculated reasonableness was a labyrinth with no clear enemy to fight. Chie, on the other hand, argued for a different perspective, one born of pragmatism and a weary understanding of systems. "The war is over," she would state, her voice calm and steady in the darkness. "The emperor himself has commanded us to lay down our arms and endure the unendurable. Our duty is no longer to fight. It is to survive, to return to Japan, and to help rebuild what has been lost. What these British do and why they do it is not our concern. Whether it is a trick or their custom matters little. Our task is to observe their rules, to perform our work, and to maintain our discipline. Survival is now our battlefield. Do not mistake stubbornness for strength." Her arguments appealed to the older women, those who had families and memories of a life before the war. They understood the logic of adaptation, the necessity of bending so as not to break. They saw compliance not as a betrayal but as a strategy. Haney lay on her bunk, listening to these debates night after night, feeling herself pulled in both directions. Akiko's passionate certainty was compelling. It offered a clear moral framework in a world that had lost all its bearings. But it did not align with what Haney had seen and felt. She remembered the professional, impersonal touch of Nurse Eleanor's hands bandaging her arm. She remembered the shared, spontaneous laughter in the dark mess hall. She remembered the simple, earthy satisfaction of pulling a weed from the garden. These were small, concrete realities, sensory truths that Akiko's grand, abstract theories could not erase. Her own indoctrination was a rigid, brittle thing, and these small, human experiences were like tiny cracks spreading across its surface. She did not speak in the debates, offering no opinion. Instead, she became a silent repository of contradictions. She watched Akiko's fierce, self-imposed isolation and saw the fear beneath the anger. She observed Chie's calm, methodical compliance and recognized the deep, unspoken grief it concealed. The tension in the barracks was a quiet, internal struggle, a war fought not with weapons, but with perceptions. Each new day brought fresh evidence for both sides. A guard who offered a piece of his own chocolate to a woman who was ill became, for some, a sign of human decency, and for Akiko, proof of a deliberate campaign of seduction. The regular delivery of medical supplies was, to Chie, a logical component of camp management, while to others, it was a mystery to be regarded with deep suspicion. The prisoners were caught between the world they had been told existed and the world they were now experiencing. The propaganda had been a simple, brutal map, but the territory they now inhabited was complex, filled with nuance and paradox. In the dim glow of the single lantern left burning in the Barak aisle, the faces of the sleeping women were a landscape of this inner conflict, some furrowed in anxious dreams, others placid and still. They were living in the quiet, unsettling space between two irreconcilable truths. Several weeks into their internment, the women were informed that they would be permitted to write letters to their families in Japan. The news was received with a wave of complex emotions. A surge of hope, a pang of homesickness, and a deep uncertainty about what to say. They were issued thin sheets of paper and small, sharpened pencils. The act of writing, of trying to distill their bewildering experience into words, became a moment of profound self-reflection. That evening, the main room of the Barak was filled with the quiet scratching of pencils on paper. By the dim, yellow glow of a few strategically placed lanterns, the women sat hunched over their makeshift desks, their laps, their bunks, the floor. The light cast long, dancing shadows on the wooden walls, creating an atmosphere of intense, focused intimacy. Chia sat straight-backed at a small table, her paper laid out before her. She was writing to her younger sister in Nagasaki, though she had no way of knowing if her sister, or even the city itself, still existed. She chose her words with the same meticulous care she used to count supplies in the depot. She could not write of her fear or confusion. The ever-present reality of the censor's stamp forbade it. The British officer would read every word. So she wrote of practical things. She wrote that she was healthy, that the climate was cool, that the food was adequate. She described the daily routine of work and rest. Each sentence was a carefully constructed facade, a statement of fact that revealed nothing of the turmoil within. "We are treated correctly, according to procedure," she wrote, the phrase feeling both perfectly true and deeply dishonest. The simple act of forming the characters, of trying to communicate across an immense distance, forced her to confront the chasm between her external reality and her internal state. She was a name in a ledger, a functioning part of a system, but her spirit remained in a state of suspended animation. Akiko, true to her convictions, refused to participate. She sat on her bunk with her arms crossed, her back rigid, watching the others with a look of scornful pity. "You are writing to ghosts," she said quietly to a woman nearby, "and you are collaborating with the enemy to do it. Your words will be used against us, twisted into propaganda." For her, the act of writing was an act of surrender, an acknowledgement of the enemy's power over their lines of communication. To remain silent was to maintain the last bastion of her spiritual independence. Haney sat with her paper on her knees, the pencil feeling heavy and useless in her hand. She wanted to write to her mother, to tell her she was alive, but the words would not come. How could she describe this place? How could she explain the kindness that felt like a weapon, the order that felt like a cage? Any attempt to describe the truth felt like a betrayal, of her own experience, of her country's narrative, of her family's expectations. Her mind was a tangle of contradictory images. The hiss of the showers, the warmth of the bread, the coldness of the wire fence, the impassive face of Sergeant Davies. Instead of writing, she began to draw. In the bottom corner of the page, she sketched a small, detailed image of a single cabbage leaf from the garden, capturing the intricate pattern of its veins and the way a dewdrop clung to its edge. It was a fragment of her reality, a small, tangible truth that required no explanation. It was all she could honestly offer. The next day, the letters were collected. Chia watched as Sergeant Davies sat in the administration hut, processing the small pile of correspondence. He worked methodically, reading each letter before applying the censor's stamp with a firm, decisive thud. It was the same impersonal efficiency with which he managed every other aspect of the camp. He was not a malevolent spy, but a bureaucrat, ensuring the rules were followed. The stamp, with its purple ink and official crest, was another symbol of their captivity, a reminder that even their most personal thoughts were subject to the enemy's control. Yet, it was also part of the system that was keeping them alive. The ledger on his desk, the stamp in his hand, the letters in the pile. They were all artifacts of this strange, new world, a world governed not by passion or hatred, but by the quiet, relentless logic of the written record. The Highland winter began to set in, bringing with it a persistent, chilling rain and a dampness that seemed to seep into the very timbers of the barracks. The camp's large boiler, which supplied hot water for the showers and the laundry, became the facility's beating heart, its steady thrum a constant presence. One morning that heart faltered. A loud clang echoed from the boiler house, followed by a terrifying hiss of escaping steam. Within minutes, the hot water in the laundry taps slowed to a lukewarm trickle and then stopped completely. A plume of white vapor billowed from the boiler house door, a sign of a serious breakdown. The camp's routine, so carefully constructed, was thrown into disarray. A cold laundry was a threat to hygiene, a serious problem in a crowded internment camp. Sergeant Davies and a British engineer, a corporal named Evans, were dispatched to fix the problem. They emerged from the boiler house half an hour later, faces streaked with grease and frustration. A main pressure valve was rusted shut, and they couldn't get enough leverage to turn it without risking a catastrophic pipe failure. The entire system was dangerously overpressurized. Work details were halted. The women were confined to their barracks, and a nervous quiet settled over the camp. From their windows they could see Davies and Evans arguing, their gestures sharp and angry. Chia watched them from the door of her own barack, her brow furrowed. Before the war, she had spent 2 years as a supervisor in an Osaka factory that manufactured engine components. She understood machinery, the intricate logic of pipes and valves and pressure. She could see from their frantic efforts that they were focusing on the main valve, applying brute force where precision was needed. She knew there had to be a secondary release, a smaller valve designed to bleed pressure from the system safely. She hesitated. To interfere was to step far outside the established boundaries of a prisoner. It was to invite ridicule or worse, punishment for insubordination. Akiko, standing nearby, muttered, "Let them fail. It is not our concern," but Chia also saw the broader implications. No hot water meant no proper washing. It meant the potential for sickness. It was a threat to the fragile stability of their existence. After a moment of internal debate, her practical nature won out. She walked out of the barack and approached the 2 British soldiers. They stopped their work and stared at her, their expressions a mixture of surprise and annoyance. "Get back to your quarters," Davies ordered, his voice sharp. Chia did not understand the words, but the tone was clear. She stood her ground. She pointed at the main valve they were struggling with and shook her head. Then, using deliberate, clear gestures, she traced the path of a smaller, adjacent pipe with her finger, ending at a small, unassuming wheel valve tucked away behind a tangle of wiring. She mimed the act of turning it slowly, then pointed back to the main valve and made a gesture of it turning easily. Evans, the engineer, looked at her with open skepticism. "What's she on about?" he asked Davies. "Thinks she's a bloody mechanic? Does she?" Davies stared at Chia for a long moment. He saw not a defiant prisoner, but a woman communicating a technical idea with quiet confidence. He was a man who respected competence above all else. His frustration with the boiler overrode his institutional prejudice. With a grunt, he decided to trust the prisoner's silent advice. "All right, let's try it," he said to Evans. "Can't get any worse." Evans, grumbling, reached behind the wiring and put a wrench on the small valve Chia had indicated. He turned it cautiously. A loud, controlled hiss erupted as a jet of steam vented from a release nozzle near the ceiling. They let the pressure bleed for a full minute until the violent hissing subsided to a gentle sigh. Then Davies put his wrench back on the main valve. This time, when he heaved, it moved, turned slowly, groaning in protest, but it turned. The crisis was over. Davies straightened up, wiping sweat and grease from his forehead with the back of his hand. He looked over at Chia, who stood watching, her expression calm. There was a long, silent moment. The chasm between captor and captive, victor and vanquished, remained. But in that moment, it was bridged by a shared understanding of mechanics, a common respect for a problem solved. Davies did not smile. He did not offer thanks. He simply gave her a short, sharp nod, a gesture of acknowledgement from one practical person to another. Then he turned back to his work. Chia nodded back, just as curtly, and returned to her barack. The interaction had lasted less than 2 minutes, but its impact was immense. Akiko had watched the entire exchange, her face a mask of conflicting emotions. She had seen an act of clear, undeniable competence that had transcended the hierarchy of the camp. It was not collaboration. It was a demonstration of skill. The human bridge that had been built was not one of friendship, but of mutual professional respect. And in the quiet, orderly world of the camp, that was a currency more valuable than any sentiment. That afternoon, the hot water returned. As the months passed and 1946 began, a new rumor began to circulate through the camp, a whisper of a word that was almost too hopeful to be spoken aloud. Repatriation. At first, it was just speculation, but then official-looking men in uniforms with different insignia began to visit the camp, consulting with the commandant and studying the ledgers that contained the women's names. The tension in the camp shifted from the dull ache of indefinite detention to the sharp, anxious excitement of a possible end. Finally, the day came. The women were assembled in the main yard, the same place where they had stood in terrified silence on their first day. The camp commandant stood before them, a sheaf of papers in his hand. The translator's voice rang out across the silent crowd, confirming the rumors. A repatriation schedule had been approved. Their names would be read out in batches over the coming weeks. They were going home. A collective, audible sigh swept through the ranks of the prisoners. It was a sound of immense, complicated relief, a release of pressure that had been building for months. But it was mixed with a new anxiety. What would they be returning to? What was left of their homes, their families, their country? The first group of women was scheduled to depart a week later. The names were read from the list. Akiko's was among them. Chie and Haney were not. The days leading up to the departure were a flurry of administrative activity. The women on the list went through a final, thorough medical examination with Nurse Eleanor. She checked their weight, gave them inoculations for the journey, and updated their records with the same calm efficiency she had shown from the beginning. They were taken to the supply depot, where Chie, in a strange reversal of roles, helped the British corporal issue them with travel rations. Tins of fish, hard biscuits, and a small canvas bag for their belongings. They were being provisioned for their departure with the same impersonal care with which they had been sustained during their internment. The final step was processing out. One by one, the women were called into the administration hut where Sergeant Davies sat at his desk. Before him lay the official repatriation forms. Each woman had to confirm her identity and sign or place her thumbprint on the document that would release her from custody. When it was Akiko's turn, she strode into the hut, her head held high. She stood before Davies' desk, her face set in the same defiant mask she had worn since her arrival. He pushed the form toward her without looking up from his paperwork. She picked up the pen, and with a sharp, angry flick of her wrist, signed her name. It was her final act of resistance, a signature that was a slash of contempt. She turned and left without a word. The process was the epitome of the camp's ethos, a bureaucratic procedure, devoid of emotion, that nonetheless held the power of freedom and a return to life. There was no farewell ceremony, no speeches. The system that had brought them in was now processing them out. On the morning of departure, the trucks rumbled back into the camp, parking in the same spot where they had first unloaded their human cargo. The air was cold, the sky a pale, washed-out gray. The departing women huddled together, their meager possessions in their hands. As Akiko climbed into the back of a truck, she paused and looked back at the camp. She saw Chie and Haney standing with the other remaining prisoners, watching. For a fleeting second, her fierce composure seemed to waver. A look of uncertainty, perhaps even fear, crossed her face. Then it was gone, replaced by the familiar mask of defiance. She turned away and disappeared into the shadows of the truck. The engines roared to life, and the convoy began to move, retracing the winding path down the mountain. Those left behind watched until the trucks were out of sight, the sound of their engines fading into the highland quiet. The camp felt larger, emptier. The departure was not a joyous liberation, but a quiet, administrative transfer. It was an uneasy farewell, a severing of a strange and unwanted bond that had been forged in the shared rhythm of daily life. The routine would continue, but the end was now a certainty, and the quiet, lingering respect they had developed for the system that held them was now mixed with the deep, unsettling question of what would come next. Haney's name was in the final group to be repatriated. In the weeks after Akiko and the others had left, a quiet melancholy had settled over the remaining women. The end of their captivity was no longer a distant hope but an imminent reality, and with it came the full weight of returning to a world they no longer knew. The daily routines continued with the same clockwork precision, but now each task felt like the last time she would weed this particular row of cabbages, the last time she would wash her bowl in the mess hall, the last time she would fold her blanket into a perfect square on her bunk. The camp, once a place of terror and then of grudging acceptance, had become a strange, predictable sanctuary from the unknown horrors that might await them in a defeated and devastated Japan. On the morning of her departure, Haney woke before the bell. The barack was quiet, filled with the soft sounds of sleeping women. She dressed in the darkness, her movements slow and deliberate. She had nothing to pack save for the clothes she wore and a small collection of smooth, gray stones she had gathered from the garden's edge. She walked to the window and looked out. The sky was just beginning to lighten, the pre-dawn air thick with mist that clung to the ground and swirled around the bases of the silent watchtowers. The world was rendered in shades of gray, soft and indistinct. There was no sign of the guards yet, no movement in the yard. The camp was holding its breath. Then, a light flickered on in the cookhouse. It was a single, warm, yellow rectangle against the vast, cool gray of the dawn. It was a sign that the camp's rhythm was beginning again, the first beat of another day's routine. The bakers would be starting the bread, the cooks preparing the porridge. Even as the camp was emptying, its fundamental processes continued. As she watched, a plume of white vapor began to rise from a vent on the roof of the distant laundry building. It was steam from the boiler, the one Chia had helped to fix. It rose steadily into the still air, a soft, ethereal column against the dark backdrop of the jungle-clad hills. It was a quiet, unassuming signal of the camp's enduring, functional heart. It represented the system that had defined their lives for nearly a year, a system that was impersonal, unyielding, and yet, in its own way, profoundly decent. It was not a symbol of forgiveness or friendship. It was a symbol of order, of a machine that had been designed to preserve rather than to destroy. It was the steam that had cleansed them upon their arrival, the warmth that had cooked their food, the power that had washed their clothes. It was the physical manifestation of the camp's strange, disarming morality. The steam drifted upwards, its edges blurring as it merged with the morning mist, becoming indistinguishable from the clouds. It was a quiet, transient thing, a breath of warmth in the cold air, and then it was gone. The bell for roll call finally clanged, its harsh sound shattering the morning stillness. It was time to leave. Haney did not look away from the window. She kept her eyes fixed on the spot where the steam had been, the lingering image of that quiet white plume, a final, indelible impression of this place. The truck would be waiting, and the world beyond the wire was a terrifying unknown. But in this last, quiet moment, she felt a strange and paradoxical sense of peace. She had survived. She had been cared for. She had been a name in a ledger, a number in a routine, and in that impersonal, procedural embrace, she had been allowed to endure. The image of the steam, rising and disappearing into the gray Malayan morning, would remain with her long after the memory of the wire and the watchtowers had begun to fade. It was the closing image of her war, a quiet testament to an enemy who had defeated her with bread, with soap, and with the relentless, humane logic of a well-run machine.